This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Very welcome to the final seminar of this term for the History of Sexuality. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Diana Jeater, who's Professor of History, Southern African History at Goldsmiths. Her paper tonight is called Sexuality, Aids and the Past in Zimbabwe, Interweaving Discourses and Contested Histories. Now, just to give some background, Diana's most recent work, which I managed to glean, is on witchcraft and cultures of violence in Southern Africa. It's fascinating. And also you're involved, I've noticed, with recent work on evangelical religion and questions of masculinities in the contemporary history of Zimbabwe. And tonight's paper, I'm really grateful, Diana, that you've giving us this paper tonight. It's the IHR seminars marking of World AIDS Day, which is today. So if I may hand over to you.
Thank you. Yes, my first book, which was based on my doctoral thesis, was called Marriage, Perversion and Power. And that was about how a discourse of sexuality emerged in Zimbabwe in the early 20th century. And so I'm drawing on that research in what I'm talking about today. So first of all, some information about AIDS and Zimbabwe. In 1999, Zimbabwe was the world's most infected HIV country, or the world's most HIV-infected country. There was a dramatic drop in new infection rates over the following 10 years, and by 2006, there had been the world's largest decline in new infection rates. And these were attributed to behavioural changes. But by 2015, largely as a result of the intervention of Bill Gates and Melinda Gates' Global Fund, top-down approaches focused much more on treatment and handing out antiretrovirals, and less funding was put into behavioural changes. Also, part of what I want to problematise in this talk is how far the behavioural change campaigns can be used to explain what happened, given the complexity of sexual behaviours and what encourages people to change their sexual behaviours. Now, inevitably, the issue of HIV was politicised, and sometimes it was politicised in unexpected ways. Or rather, it was removed from the political discourse in unexpected ways. I'm sure you're all aware that in the early 2000s, white land was redistributed in Zimbabwe. There were the land seizures, and there was a huge exodus of people, whites because they'd lost their livelihoods, and black Africans because they were politically opposed to the government, and the government was not brooking any opposition at that point. But alongside the land redistribution, there was hyperinflation, to the point where it's really not even hyperinflation. What happened was simply that the currency became worthless. And so it was in free fall against hard currencies like the Zimbabwean dollar. So there was never a point at which there was a realistic exchange rate, because there was no exchange rate. So there was hyperinflation and there was economic crisis, all of which was blamed on the government. And alongside this, it was noted that life expectancy had dropped dramatically. And so in 2006, the World Health Organization said that projected life expectancy for adults in Zimbabwe at that point was 34 for women and 37 for men. And this became one of the biggest sticks with which the Zimbabwean government was beaten, that it had produced such an appalling drop in life expectancy. However, if one looks at predictions of life expectancy based on the experience of the HIV epidemic before any of the political or economic crisis took place, one sees the same figures. In other words, that drop in life expectancy was not due to the economic crisis, or not primarily due to the economic crisis. It was far more related to the AIDS crisis. And we can see this because as treatment is spread through the country through Global Fund support, and as new infection rates drop, so the life expectancy has increased in a way that's disproportionate to the recovery of the economy. So it's currently apparently 56 for men and 61 for women. And women have once again overtaken men as likely to live longer. So what has all this got to do with the history of sexuality? Clearly it has to do with sexuality, but this is a seminar about the history of sexuality. The history of sexuality is important in understanding what's happening in response to the AIDS crisis in Africa in general, not simply because history is always important to everything, obviously, but primarily because of what's become known as the Caldwell Thesis, which one can link back to a Caldwell et al. Publication in 1989, which implied that there was throughout Africa a vibrant heteronormative masculinity, and that stood in the way of safe sex messages. So it's important to look at the history of sexuality to see whether this thesis about the construction of African male sexuality stands up to scrutiny. So looking at the history of sexuality, and importantly here, its links to ideas about morality and its links to ideas about disease, which one can unpack as to dis-ease, social unease. Dis-ease, disease, morality and sexuality are all very closely linked in African modes of thought and African constructions of sexuality long before we have the specific application of how these apply to the HIV crisis. So looking at the history of sexuality challenges oversimplification of the problem, so defined, of African sexuality. It also opens up the possibility of including same-sex sexuality into the conversation, and it challenges the pathologizing of African sexuality. And also, it illustrates why ideas about illness and witchcraft must be part of the conversation. So by looking at the history of sexuality, it moves us beyond a simple narrative of an oversexed African male heteronormativity. Now, what right have I got to talk to you about any of this? Well, I would like to point out I'm not an expert on the HIV situation in Zimbabwe, and that's not why I'm here. However, it's impossible to be as involved in working in Zimbabwe as I've been over many years without also being involved in the HIV crisis. I have close friends who are positive. And I co-organised the UK tour of the first black African woman, or indeed the first black African, in Zimbabwe to come out as HIV positive. And that was as recently as 1989. There was many years of stigma in which people did not say that they were positive. And it was Auxilia Chimusoro who should go down in history because she made a huge difference to the ability to talk about and therefore to begin campaigns for behavioural change regarding HIV. And the other reason why I've developed a greater knowledge than I would ever have hoped to have had really about provision for treatment for HIV in Zimbabwe is because of the asylum cases of Zimbabwean asylum seekers coming to the UK. And even if they cannot claim asylum on purely political grounds, there are human rights grounds, one of which is the availability of treatment for HIV positive status. And so I've been having to track the available treatments over the years. But my expertise is in two areas. Firstly, the accounts of African sexuality in the archives, where we can find them and how we can interpret them, who is producing them. Rather more difficult, because the archives are hard to interpret, is to reconstruct Africans' own discourses of sexuality and what, if anything, on the basis of the available data, we can say about constructions of African sexuality in Zimbabwe in the past. Now, you will be pleased to hear, I hope you'll be pleased to hear, that I'm going to claim that we can say something. Otherwise, there would be no history of sexuality to be talking about now. But I first want to put this in the context of the AIDS discourses of the 1990s. As I've said, we have the Caldwell Thesis from 1989 onwards of unbridled heterosexuality, which is claimed to be uniform across the continent. This is an African problem. And so campaigns informed by the Caldwell Thesis, were concerned to change behaviours and to challenge tradition, and saw traditional constructions of African sexuality as being part of the problem. Now, obviously, the behavioural campaigns that were inherited from Europe and America are bound to be inappropriate in an African context simply because this is a polygynous context. And so campaigns that are focused around having only one partner are clearly going to be inappropriate in a society where it is normal for people to have more than one partner. But beyond that obvious example, there are particular issues that are more than simply the bad fit of messages imported from elsewhere. This focus on challenging African traditions has a long history. Whites have been trying to change African sexual behaviours and African traditions for as long as they've been present in Zimbabwe in any significant numbers from the 1890s onwards. And that was the focus of my research when I was doing my doctoral work. Fortunately, the archives are still the same. They haven't changed, although the interpretations have changed, and so I can still draw on the same data. What we see with white interventions from their first presence in Zimbabwe is a misunderstanding and an oversimplification of traditions. As I've mentioned, there are misunderstandings and oversimplifications of ideas about health and illness and morality, what health means in an African context, how illness is understood and how it's categorized. The ontologies of illness are also important here. And the importance of witchcraft in what Isaac Niehaus, an anthropologist, has called the sexuality of evil, which we can put alongside, as he does, the evil of sexuality. And most importantly, I think, how morality has different constructs, different meanings, and different valences in an African context from those that had been inherited from Europe at the end of the 19th century, and how morality has more to do with hierarchies and the exercise of power than it has to do with particular forms of behaviour. So if we look at this idea of tradition, Caldwell et al. Reflect a story about pre-colonial heteronormativity that arose out, and their story arose out of particular circumstances. They were attempting to address a problem in which behavioural responses to HIV didn't seem to be having the same effect that they were having in a European context, albeit in a different set of communities in the European and American contexts. So they problematized African sexuality and the problem of multiple partners. But of course, in neither Africa nor Europe, nor indeed in the United States, if we see that as separate from Europe, is there a single coherent discourse of sexuality. There isn't a single African sexuality any more than there is a single sexuality or indeed morality for any community. These things change over time and they're all shaped by current anxieties and current interests. So to make claims about an overarching African sexuality is unhelpful and uninformative and uninformed. But nonetheless, some broad generalizations can be made about the issues where African societies in general, and certainly Southern African societies, and specifically Zimbabwean African societies, the areas in which they saw that sexuality was relevant and important. So the areas in which there is a tendency to attempt to regulate sexuality can broadly be seen as comparable across the Southern African region and to some extent across the African continent. The first of these, it will be no surprise, is an emphasis on fertility, the importance of having children. There's clearly a political economy that underpins this. In agricultural societies, the more children one has, the more labour one has, the more wives one has, the more labour one has. In an African context where it is women who do the agricultural work. And as part of that, there is also an emphasis on alliances between families, which enables the circulation of fertile women. And this is coordinated through the Bridewell system, sometimes shorthand wives for cattle. But it was misunderstood by whites as being the sale of women for cattle, but of course this wasn't what it was at all. It's a system in which wealth is circulated and in which alliances are confirmed by a transfer of cattle on the one hand, fertile women on the other. So there's a lot of emphasis on making sure that young people do as they're told and that they stick by the alliances that have been created, and that if women become pregnant by people for whom bride wealth who have not paid bride wealth for those women, that compensation is paid, that there is a penalty. But none of this is the same thing as sexuality. To see that there's an emphasis on fertile women and an emphasis on alliances that encourage marriages of fertile women is not at all the same thing as a discussion about sexuality. Certainly it's policed. Young people and indeed older people are expected to stay within the bounds of the alliances that have been created, and the policing is about making sure that those alliances work and that where they're violated, that the families involved can claim compensation. But again, that's not the same thing as policing sexuality. So the Caldwell Thesis says that the problem is African traditional sexuality, but Africans say that the problem is the destruction of their traditional ways of policing where and when and people have sex, though not how they have sex. The African complaint that the problem is the destruction of tradition is something that they said throughout the 20th century. It's nothing new. And tradition is, of course, something that is always invented in the present to make claims in the present based on the past. So the tradition of control of African sexuality is constantly reinvented. It's being reinvented in the present in the context of the AIDS crisis, but it was being reinvented in the 1910s in the context of industrialization, the availability of non-agricultural options for both young men and young women. Nonetheless, although tradition and controls over sexual activity and claims about controls over sexual activity are constantly being reinvented in the present, there is some historical evidence for a particular system that we can generalize and say was in place amongst Shona speakers in Zimbabwe at the beginning of the 20th century. Control, as I've said, over young people's sexuality was important in order to direct and control their partnerships and the reproduction that went along with that. That control was policed by elders, same-sex elders, so female elders for young women, male elders for young men, and these elders would be from the same lineage as the young people. This means, therefore, that it is not mothers who control the sexuality of their daughters, but it is their aunts, it is the sisters of their brothers. Elders don't stop with death. Ancestral spirits also police the behaviour of the young people in order to protect the lineage interests, and they do this by causing illness when it's felt that people are violating alliances that have been made between lineages, for example, by committing adultery. So sexuality and sexual behaviour isn't seen as an individual's attribute, an individual's behaviour. It's seen as part of a larger set of interests in which the maintenance of the rules is there in order to maintain a set of important wealth-related alliances. One can get very functionalist and anthropological about this, but even without saying that this is the only thing that's going on, it is certainly an important part of what's going on, is that control of sexuality is about maintaining the alliances that keep the whole economic system running. So when there's a violation in sexual behaviour, the problem is not the behaviour itself. Unlike the discourses that are imported from Europe, that Foucault has talked about at length, the problem isn't that certain behaviours are seen as in some sense perverse or immoral. The problem is that behaviours are disrupting larger groups and larger group interests. So behaviours are not good or bad, moral or immoral in themselves. It's not what people do in bed, or rather on the mat, that matters. It's the consequences of what they do that matters. So this is not about morality as a set of absolute values. It's about collective responsibility for behaviours. And this is very different from the discourses of morality that were brought in by the white state. And again, this is not to say that the discourses of morality that were brought in by the white state were universal in Europe. The point is that there were particular reasons why the white occupiers would impose a certain set of ideas about sexual behaviour and moral behaviour in the context of their occupation of this territory. So, a discourse emerges. Actually, I'll come back to that point later, but I just want to continue with the question about tradition for now. The discourse emerges that there was a tradition in which Africans controlled the behaviour of their communities and of their lineages. And in the 1960s, an alliance emerged between African nationalist elites on the one hand and white liberals on the other to represent this as a tradition that had been destroyed by white occupation. So by the time that Caldwell et al. Start to look at stories about African sexuality, what they see is stories about a sexuality that had existed and was now in turmoil and needed to be controlled because traditional ways of controlling it had completely broken down. But that story about traditional ways completely breaking down was very much rooted in the politics of the 1960s. So there was an agreement about how things had been before the whites came in, that we find in white liberal discourses and in African nationalist discourses, a kind of Mother Africa trope that gets represented in a lot of nationalist literature about how everything was great until the whites turned up. People regulated their sexuality, and there was a strong sense of heteronormativity. Everybody stayed in these heterosexual relationships. It was all beautifully policed. And what's happened now, as a result of European intervention and disruption, it says immorality, promiscuity, and prostitution. And the solution to that is a return to tradition. So the exact opposite of the conclusions that Caldwell et al. Draw, which is what's needed is a return to tradition. Now, of course, there is some truth in these accounts that systems of control were disrupted by white occupation, industrialisation, and so forth. And indeed, that's what my book, Marriage, Perversion and Power, is largely about. But to focus on this loss of a mythical Edenic heteronormativity is to focus only on European ways of understanding what had happened. So it tends to over-report the rise of prostitution, which was something that was perceived as a problem by the white state, to under-report same-sex sex, because that's not something that was really an issue for the white state, and nor, I would argue, for African societies prior to that either, because it didn't disrupt lineage relationships, because it didn't involve fertile women. And of course, this Edenic heteronormativity that existed in tradition, again, homogenizes societies and homogenizes historical processes. But if we look at the discourses that we get in the African communities, their focus of disruption is not so much on the rise of prostitution or the rise of immorality or the rise of promiscuity in themselves. Their concern is much more over what happens when wives cannot be controlled in the ways they need to be controlled in order for polygynous lineage systems to continue. And if we look at their focus, we can see that their concern is not with sexuality or with sexual behaviours. It's much more a question of where power and wealth are being contested and where they're being resolved. And that happens to be around issues over the control of fertile women most of the time. So what's happening is that where African communities are concerned about power and wealth and the circulation of power and wealth, white communities are concerned about what they define as immorality and promiscuity. And these issues get conflated so that public issues in which everybody has an interest become seen in the European discourse as private issues to do with sexuality. And so sexuality becomes privatized and becomes a matter of behaviors, because the Europeans have a discourse of individual sexuality. In fact, they have a discourse about individual everything. At the same time, they're trying to bring in individual land ownership, land holdings, and they want individual wage labour. They, on the one hand, worry about the destruction of the old ties that kept people together, and simultaneously they want to create something that looks much more like a free market economy. And of course, the white occupation is not an internally coherent thing anyhow. So for whites, there is a discourse of othering Africans. There is a sense that Africans are not moral and are not civilized, whereas whites are moral and civilized. And the job of the occupation is to bring Africans into civilization. However, having set up this dichotomy, there's no agreement about the content of either side of that equation. So the whites disagree over what is immoral and what is simply uncivilized. So for missionaries, it's absolutely fine for Africans to pay bride wealth because that shows that they're serious about marriage. But the state has concerns about the payment of bride wealth because it disrupts other forms of free market economics. On the other hand, the state is perfectly happy and sees it as perfectly moral for African men to have more than one wife, whereas the missionaries see this as evidence of immorality. So we have conflicting discourses of what is moral, and all that's clear is that the Africans are on the bad side of it, whatever it is. One example of this is white discourse of child sex. There's a system within bride wealth in which when a family is in crisis, it can go to another family and it can pledge a daughter. And in return, it can be bailed out from its immediate crisis. The daughter will then, when she reaches maturity, be available either to the head of the household who had bailed her family out, or to some other male to whom he has responsibility as head of his household to provide a wife. However, this was interpreted by whites as pledging young girls to old men. And for them, it was a form of paedophilia. They sexualized pledging arrangements. They had not been sexual arrangements up to that point, although obviously a sexual relationship was envisaged at some point down the line, because the whole point is that this woman would be a fertile woman when she reached maturity. But sex was not the primary frame of reference for the Africans in pledging arrangements. Nonetheless, the white state outlawed child pledging. And in doing so, it changed the frame in which child pledging was understood. So African frameworks for thinking were attacked and dismantled by state intervention. And by the 1910s, there's a whole new way of thinking about sex and sexuality that's coming into the white communities that occupies a category of perversity that doesn't meaningfully seem to have existed prior to white intervention. Which is not to say that there were not behaviours that in a European sense would be called perverse. The point is that they wouldn't have been put within that frame of a discourse of sexual immorality. They would instead have been put within a framework of witchcraft, something which the community needs to respond to as a community, because it is a behaviour that goes beyond something that can be settled through simple payment of compensation. It's interesting that rape doesn't fit into the category of witchcraft and perversity, because rape is not primarily an offence against the woman's body. Rape is primarily an offence against one family's investment in another woman's body. And in this sense, it's not really important whether there is penetration or not. The defining aspect of rape in European law is absent in African law. And in fact, most of the reported sexual assaults don't involve penetration. It's interesting that the ones that do involve penetration or attempted penetration are ones committed against a woman when she's asleep. And this seems to be quite a common form of offence. And thinking through why this would be the case, why an attempt to have sex with a woman while she's asleep would emerge as quite a common behaviour, it's because consent is not an issue. If the woman consents or not does not define the offence within African society. So in European society, a man has a defence. She consented. No such defence exists in African society because the offence is not against the woman. Therefore, the only hope that a man has of committing an offence of this nature and getting away with it is the hope that the woman will not know who he is. Therefore, it helps if she's asleep at the time. She might think that it's her husband. And very often this is what women say. I thought it was my husband. Then I realised it wasn't. And then I recognised him and chased him away. But there must have been cases, in fact we know there's cases because they get reported, where women cannot identify the man. And he gets away with it, not because she consented or didn't consent, but because they just don't know who he was. We see examples of how the state's intervention in African sexual behaviour, such as the banning of child sex, the banning of pledging, the insistence that the woman consents before marriage, begins to affect behaviours in surprising ways. One example is a man who approached a group of Africans waiting at a railway station one night and asked who the wives were, and said that he was given authority by the whites to check all of them to see if they're virgins. And he touches up all of the women. And the men are not sure whether this man actually has this authority or not, because there is lack of clarity about where the state claims to be able to intervene in African sexual lives starts and finishes. After the man leaves, the party go and report it and say, was he really one of you guys? Did he have authority to do this? And it's discovered that he didn't, and so it ends up in the court, and that's why we know about it. In a similar case, a young man attempts to abduct two young women, again saying he has the right to do so because he has to make sure that they're not loose women. Right, I've still got, how much have I got left to do?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So, we have the white state because it comes with a set of ideas about sex and morality and civilization, being concerned about the sex lives of Africans. Partly because it has a narrative that says we need to civilize these people in order to justify our presence here, and also to make our presence here more effective. And partly because by undermining the robust indigenous systems of agricultural production and wealth, they will shake out people from rural production and create the possibility of a labour force that's available for waged labour. Of course, in the process of doing that, they also shake out women. and spaces begin to exist for women to live outside of the constraints of bride wealth payments, marriage, fertility, motherhood. So while on the one hand, a discourse of African immorality, sexual depravity is developing in the official sphere, there are also genuine changes in the control and construction of sexuality going on within African society, partly as a result of state intervention, but more importantly, because of the change in the socio-economic conditions in which people can live and behave. So we have the rise of prostitution because for the first time there are women who can be prostitutes in a way that it was not meaningful previously to think of a woman who could dispose of her body entirely on her own terms and for remuneration. Because up till that point, had a woman had sex with another man, her husband's family or her father's family would have had a vested interest in that and would have demanded compensation or bride wealth payment from the person involved. It would not have been her wealth in the compensation. So there's no sense prior to this point that sex is something that you can sell. Sexual transgressions need to be compensated, but that's very different from selling sex. Again, a difference that the whites were not entirely clear about and often thought that what was happening with payment of compensation was a form of pimping. Moreover, missionaries, in their attempts to civilize Africans and wean them off their uncivilized and immoral practices, tried to ban the spaces in which sex was discussed. In particular, aunts would teach daughters about how to behave sexually, how to please their husbands. There is a strong sense that women had a right to sexual enjoyment, but it was sexual enjoyment that they should expect from their husbands. So if they didn't get it, they could complain, but the expectation was that it would be within marriage. And they were taught about sexual pleasure by their aunts. And there were spaces in which aunts would talk very openly and lewdly about sex, and the missionaries closed down those spaces wherever they could. Another activity which taught young people about sex was playing house, which was for children on the cusp of puberty to act out, to play house, just in the same way as children do in their Wendy houses here, so that they learned gender roles as much as they learned sexual behaviour. The sexual behaviour teaching came later. But still, they would pair up and the girls would be expected to pretend to sleep with the boys and so forth. And all of that was got rid of as well. Also, there were constraints on discussing incest taboos, which had been very important in regulating sexuality and giving the opportunity to talk about sexuality. And again, these were considered to be inappropriate behaviours, and missionaries tried very hard to stop people talking about them. There was recognition amongst the administrators in the state who had specific responsibility for African life that incest taboos were important because they were part of the construction of lineages that controlled everything else that followed from that in terms of identity and behaviour and economics. But there was massive embarrassment about talking about these things and recognising their importance. So in one of the first ethnographic texts about the Shona, published in 1927 by Charles Burke, a native commissioner who also had ethnographic training, he recognises that if he's going to discuss how identity is constructed and what follows from that, he has got to write about incest taboos, but he writes that section of the book in Latin. So state intervention in family control over women's disposal in marriage on child protection grounds and on the grounds that a woman should have a right to choose her husband. There was a law that said that a woman could not marry unless she had said to a native commissioner that she consented to the marriage. These interventions change ways of thinking about women's autonomy. Both women change the way they think about their autonomy, and so do elder men. However, having taken this genie out of the bottle, the whites realise that they've created a problem for themselves because women don't do what they're told. However, because of their way of thinking about appropriate behaviours for women, there's then a tendency for the white state to construct evidence of female autonomy as a form of sexual immorality, and specifically of prostitution. So instead of thinking about controlling women in terms of pass laws or other political responses, they sexualise female independence. And in particular, they target women as beer brewers, which gives them economic independence, and they target women who desert their husbands, which again gives them a degree of independence and economic independence, and they target both of these things as sexual transgressions, as problems of promiscuity. This is partly an acknowledgement of their own powerlessness. To say the problem is that they're immoral is to say, well, it's just in their nature. There's nothing we can do about it. In the same way, the inability to control African men was ascribed to their laziness, an inherent characteristic that couldn't be controlled. But it affects the long-term state responses, both to women's sexuality and to independence. Meanwhile, for those women, one of the reasons why they're needing to assert their independence more is because there's a generalised gender crisis that is brought on through industrialisation. As agricultural production decreases in significance in the society, so women's value to the society and to their families also decreases. For proletarianised families, children become a cost rather than an asset. And for proletarianised families, you do not need multiple wives in order to be able to farm more land. So Schuyler Marx has said that the AIDS crisis was in many ways a crisis waiting to happen in southern Africa because of the upheavals of industrialisation, the rooting out of men from family contexts to become single migrant labourers, the rise in gender-based violence, the sense that women are there to be raped and abused. And she says that this rise in gender-based violence can be largely attributed to colonial violence against men, and that they're then passing it down onto women, so that they are called boy and they are beaten, and in order to assert their masculinity, they then pass that on into abusive behaviours towards women, black women, the only group who's weaker than they are. However, I think it's more than that. I also think that there is a declining economic significance for women in the society, which makes it more likely that they will not be valued by men and therefore more open to abuse. I'm sure everyone here is aware of how broadly that colonial setting produces a crisis in masculinities, particularly that use of the term boy. But this crisis in masculinity and this crisis in gender-based violence does not seem to be the only reason for the way in which the AIDS crisis then plays out. So Schuyler Marx says, well, what would you expect? But one of the things that we notice is that AIDS crisis does not just take place among the most disrupted social classes. We also see it very much amongst the elite classes as well. So clearly there's something more going on here. But what we can say is that this idea of a traditional heteronormativity that's about unbridled male sexuality does not fit the historical picture. This is not about unbridled male sexuality. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about a bridled male sexuality that then becomes disrupted by the experience of industrialization and colonization. So how then are we going to explain this problem of AIDS amongst the elites as well as amongst the poor? And this is where concepts of sickness and disease, dis-ease and sexuality come in. African conceptualizations of sickness depend on very different ontologies from those that organise ideas of sickness in the West. Not just sexually transmitted diseases, but a whole range of diseases. TB, for example, very differently conceptualised in Botswana, in African societies, from how it's conceptualised in white societies. And yet, in a brilliant piece by Julie Livingston, she says it wasn't clear that there were fundamentally different ontologies because the way of responding to them was the same. That isolation, collecting of sputum, well, those are the main ones actually, isolation and collection of sputum, which in the African ontology are to do with violations of correct sexual behaviours and the need to take oneself to a place where one re-centres one's relationship with the ancestors and gets rid of the dangerous bodily fluids that can be used by witches. Completely different ontology from that of TB as it's understood in Western medicine. But it wasn't really until Julie Livingston pointed it out that it was recognised that actually these are two different diseases, one of which has a spiritual basis and the other of which has a physical basis. So how is syphilis understood? Well, syphilis was recognised as belonging to everyone. Syphilis appears to be becoming common. It was reported in 1908. A woman says, he gave me a venereal disease when he came back from the mines and my second child died in consequence of the disease. In response to which the man defended himself by saying, I admit that I communicated syphilis to her, other men do the same, and I consider it no grounds for divorce. Now the problem is we actually have no idea what people actually said. This is how it's reported in terms that make sense to the White Court when she makes a claim for divorce. But he gave me a venereal disease. We have no idea what she meant by that. And my second child died in consequence of the disease. Again, we have no idea what she meant by that. She may be talking about a problem with ancestors, which is causing illness and is causing the child to die, a problem with ancestors that arises out of his sexual behaviours that are violating lineage alliances. Another man said, I did contract some venereal disease. Again, we don't know what he said or what he meant by that. But then he says, which we call doropo, when working at the Camellia mine. I contracted this from prostitutes and I admitted this to my wife. Now, doropo, very interesting. It's translated here as syphilis. Elsewhere we see it translated as gonorrhea. And in other places, we see it as translated as meaning something that's closer really to just to town. I contracted town and I communicated this to my wife. So we don't really know what seems to be a clear case to the whites. We don't really know what people are saying when they say that they have these diseases. But it's clear that it's linked in some way to a whole range of ideas about what a good community might be that's been violated. Now, of course, the whites also linked sex and sickness, but they racialized it. For them, the problem was perversity and degeneration, and I'm sure in this seminar you're very familiar with those discourses of perversity and degeneration and syphilis in Europe. And so there's a concern that Africans are sexually savage, and therefore they pose a threat to racial health, but not to spiritual health. So links between sex and sickness are in a European discourse about eugenics, but in an African discourse they're about spirituality and witchcraft and the importance of community well-being. So what we've got is an individualizing of sexuality and an individualizing of illness in European discourses, which don't really map onto a much more community oriented sense of both illness and of sexuality in African communities. And we see this being reproduced in AIDS campaigns, where AIDS campaigns look at the individual body. And even when they are community-based campaigns, their focus is still primarily on the sickness in the individual body and the individual body's response to that through individual behaviours. So, and I am finishing very soon. Clearly, witchcraft was linked to disease, but also to sexual perversity. That is, behaviours that can't be resolved through compensation. So witchcraft comes in when there is no other way to resolve these things. And witchcraft often involves trying to poison people. So a woman says, women used to go to nangas and ask for herbs to control their husbands and stop them going with prostitutes. Sometimes they were given the wrong medicine and they would kill their husbands, and the nangas were arrested. But sometimes it came out that the women really wanted to kill their husbands. Now, research I'm doing at the moment on witchcraft shows that there's a range of witchcraft accusations, the most trivial of which are normally linked to sexual jealousy. And then there are serious witchcraft accusations, and there were ways of telling them apart. But those processes were outlawed by the whites, who said you cannot accuse anyone of witchcraft because witchcraft doesn't exist. And so the processes were driven underground. And in the process of driving underground the systems of accusing witches, so the different typologies of types of witchcraft accusation began to get blurred. And as part of that, it seems that homosexuality also became a named behaviour that was associated with witchcraft. However, witchcraft concerns linked to AIDS appear not to be linked to sexual promiscuity in the present. We cannot tell really too clearly how witchcraft and sickness was linked in the past to promiscuity, because promiscuity wasn't a category that existed in that sense. What's said by many AIDS campaigners today when they take on board issues of witchcraft is, witchcraft is linked to people being sexually promiscuous. And sexual promiscuity leads to AIDS, and so if we make that link, then people will stop being sexually promiscuous because they don't want to be accused of witchcraft. The problem is that stigma doesn't seem to attach actually to sexual promiscuity per se in the present. Now, this is research by Isaac Niehaus, who's looking at South Africa and looking at the present. So not exactly the same as what's happening in Zimbabwe in the present, but many parallels. It's accepted that women need incomes, and that very often the only way they can do that is through promiscuity, by finding a sugar daddy or through prostitution, but more often through finding a sugar daddy. That is not a grounds for stigma. And so stigmatization of AIDS and the connection between AIDS and witchcraft and stigma doesn't seem to stack up. Witchcraft, it seems, when it comes into concerns about AIDS, is partly, as ever, anxieties over ascription of blame. Who is responsible? And very often it seems that in Zimbabwe, to bring witchcraft into the story is a way of actually diverting blame, of not blaming an individual, and certainly not blaming individuals for their infection, to put the blame somewhere else. Now, that may be somebody who is not responsible for the infection at all. It's a way of blaming people that are not... anyway, I'll come on to that in a moment, but I just want this quote from June 2002 in The Scotsman, reporting from Victoria Falls. The local monthly newspaper, Vic Falls News, reports that counsellors at an AIDS workshop have agreed that evil spirits called tokoloshes probably spread the HIV virus by sexually abusing women during the night. So it's not to do with individual behaviours. The virus is spread by spirits. Spirits were sent by other people, but those other people need not be the people that those women have had sex with. Now, clearly there are anxieties here about women who've got infected, that they are going to be accused of having had sex with people they shouldn't have had sex with. It works very comfortably in the community as a way of the community being able to deal with high levels of HIV infection. And it ascribes blame to an undefined disquiet about society in general, or individuals can be accused of having sent the tokolosh, but it takes the stigma away from the individual women. What Niehaus found in South Africa is that where there is accusations of witchcraft associated with HIV infection, this tends to be where people are thought to have been greedy. So it's about a lack of community feeling and a lack of restraint. So women can have many partners if it's recognised that they're doing it because they need to. But if women give up partners and take up with other partners who are richer than they need to be, then those women are likely to be stigmatised for having acquired AIDS and are likely to be accused of being involved in witchcraft. So promiscuity isn't framed as a dangerous behaviour in itself. Promiscuity is framed as a dangerous behaviour linked to witchcraft when it violates social norms about community feeling and community support. So again, discourses of behavioural change are not necessarily going to map easily onto discourses of promiscuity. And finally, actually that's it, finally, so to conclude, we need, when understanding how campaigns around behavioural change are likely to have effect, we need to understand where sexuality is situated and to recognise that it may be situated in multiple places. It can be situated in the body or in communities. It can be situated in behaviours, or it can be situated in hierarchies of power. And to simply say that sexuality is situated in the behaviours of bodies misses the much wider context. And how sexuality gets linked to disease and to witchcraft is as much to do with spiritual as behavioural approaches to understanding disease, and sexuality. And so it's not surprising that rather than see a rise in a concern about individual behaviours, we see a rise in Pentecostalist churches as a response to the HIV epidemic. Right, I'm sorry that went on for ages, but